On the night of October the 12th, 539 BC, the most powerful city on earth was celebrating. Inside the royal palace of Babylon, thousands of nobles and guests filled the grand banquet hall of King Belshazzar. Wine flowed freely from golden vessels. Music filled the torchlit air. The most sacred objects ever to come out of Jerusalem's destroyed temple, golden cups and silver bowls taken by force from God's own house, were brought out and passed around as ordinary drinking vessels at a Babylonian party. Nobody at that feast knew that before sunrise, the city they were celebrating in would cease to exist forever. To fully understand the weight of what happened that night, you first need to understand what Babylon actually was. Not simply a city, the undisputed center of the entire known world, the capital of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the most powerful political force in the ancient Middle East, and by almost every measure, the most spectacular human settlement that had ever existed on the face of the earth up to that point in history. Its walls, according to ancient accounts, rose over 80 feet high, so thick at the top that 2 chariots could race side by side along their surface. An unbroken circuit of fortification surrounding the entire city that no army had ever broken, and no army had ever come close to breaking. The famous Hanging Gardens, described by ancient writers as one of the 7 wonders of the world, rose above the flat Mesopotamian desert like an impossible mountain of living greenery, lush plants and trees and flowers cascading down successive stone terraces, fed by a continuous hydraulic system that carried the waters of the Euphrates River upward to the highest level. The famous Ishtar Gate, the main ceremonial entrance to the inner city, was covered entirely in brilliant blue glazed bricks, decorated with hundreds of golden dragons and bulls in relief. The most vivid and most expensive color the ancient world could produce, displayed across the most spectacular gate in human history. Inside those walls, the wealth of the entire known world flowed daily. Merchants from Egypt, Persia, India, and Greece bringing their goods through Babylon's markets. Gold and spices and fine cloth and carved ivory changing hands in the greatest commercial center the ancient world had ever produced. But behind those magnificent walls, and beneath all that extraordinary wealth, ancient sources from multiple civilizations independently recorded that something else was also happening in Babylon. Something that made it unlike any city that had ever existed, and not entirely in ways that were admirable. Ancient Greek historians, including Herodotus, claimed, and it is important to note that some of his specific claims about Babylon are debated by modern scholars, that Babylon's great temple complex was the center of religious practices that shocked visitors from other civilizations. According to Herodotus, certain rituals at Babylon's temples required participants to surrender both their dignity and their moral boundaries as acts of religious devotion, practices that even hardened ancient observers struggled to describe without considerable discomfort. Whether every specific detail recorded by ancient writers is historically verifiable remains an ongoing debate among historians. But what is consistent across ancient Greek, Persian, and Jewish sources independently is the portrait of a religious culture operating by rules that the outside world found profoundly disturbing. Beyond the temples, the inequality inside Babylon's walls was extraordinary, even by the standards of the ancient world. Conquered peoples from across the empire lived and labored inside the city in conditions that ancient sources describe as deeply unjust. The Jewish people, captured from Jerusalem following Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of their temple decades earlier, lived in Babylonian captivity, within sight of the Hanging Gardens, within hearing of the music from the royal palace, their most sacred objects stolen and sitting in Babylonian storehouses.
Ancient Jewish, Greek, and Persian writers independently recorded the same fundamental observation about Babylon. According to these sources, it was a civilization that had confused its own extraordinary power with permanent and unconditional protection. A city so completely certain of its own invincibility, so thoroughly insulated by its wealth and its walls and its river, that it had entirely lost the capacity to imagine that consequences could reach it. And it was into this city, at the absolute peak of its excess, its arrogance, and its certainty, that history delivered its most dramatic and most discussed single night. The feast that Belshazzar hosted that October night was by any ancient account extraordinary, even by Babylonian standards. Thousands of his nobles, his wives, and his court filled the great banquet hall in a celebration of Babylonian power and permanence. Then, according to the book of Daniel, Belshazzar gave a specific order that went beyond ordinary excess. He commanded that the sacred golden and silver vessels taken from the destroyed temple in Jerusalem be brought out and used for drinking at the feast. This was not a casual decision. It was a deliberate and public act of religious desecration, a statement performed before thousands of witnesses that no god and no sacred object was beyond the reach of Babylonian power. The cup that had held the most sacred liquid in the Jewish world was now being passed around a Babylonian party. Then, according to the book of Daniel, something happened in the middle of the feast that brought the entire banquet hall to absolute silence. A human hand appeared. Not a person, just a hand, disembodied, impossible, real, moving to the plaster wall of the banquet hall and beginning to write 4 words in a language that nobody at the feast could read. The book of Daniel records that Belshazzar's face went pale and his knees knocked together. The most powerful man in the most powerful city on earth, brought to physical terror by 4 words on a wall. Every scholar and wise man in Babylon was brought before the king. Not one of them could read the writing or offer any explanation of what had happened. Then the Jewish prophet Daniel, whose people had been held in captivity in this city for decades, whose God's sacred vessels were being used as drinking cups at this very feast, was brought before Belshazzar. According to the book of Daniel, Daniel read the writing, Mene, Mene, Tekel Upharsin, and delivered its meaning to the king. In the Jewish religious tradition, these words carried a verdict of devastating simplicity. Your kingdom has been numbered. You have been weighed and found wanting. Your kingdom will be given to your enemies. That very night, what neither Daniel nor Belshazzar nor any of the thousands of guests at that feast knew was that outside the walls of Babylon at that exact moment, Cyrus the Great was already ensuring those words came true before sunrise.
For weeks before that night, Cyrus had prepared a strategy Babylon never expected. Instead of attacking its famous walls, his engineers dug massive canals upstream to divert the Euphrates River. While Belshazzar's feast continued inside the palace, Cyrus gave the order. As the water slowly dropped, the river passages beneath Babylon's walls were silently exposed. Persian soldiers had waited in the riverbed for that moment. Once the water became shallow enough, they advanced through the exposed passage under cover of darkness, entering the city before any alarm was raised. Babylon, believed to be unconquerable, fell without its walls ever being breached. Cyrus had not broken the city's defenses. He had simply removed the protection everyone trusted.
Ancient sources record that Belshazzar was killed that same night. The feast celebrating Babylon's power became his last. By morning, Cyrus entered the city.
Instead of destroying Babylon or massacring its people, he restored order and spared the city from the devastation that often followed ancient conquests. According to the Cyrus cylinder, Cyrus allowed captive peoples, including the Jewish exiles, to return to their homelands. The sacred vessels taken from Jerusalem's temple were returned, and places of worship were respected. His victory became remembered not only for military brilliance, but also for remarkable restraint. Babylon became the enduring symbol of pride and human arrogance in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition. Even centuries later, the Book of Revelation used Babylon as a symbol of corrupt worldly power. The phrase, "the writing is on the wall," still survives today as a reminder that judgment can arrive long before people realize it. Whether viewed through history or faith, ancient sources reach the same conclusion. Babylon's walls remain standing. Its army was never defeated in open battle. Its food stores were untouched. Yet while the city celebrated its own invincibility, the river protecting it quietly disappeared. Some cities fall to armies. Babylon fell because it believed it never could. Subscribe to Historic Warfronts for more untold stories that shaped our world. I'll see you in the next one.